This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Good afternoon, and welcome to this Social Scholar Seminar. It's our very great privilege today to be hearing from Myles Runham, who is Head of Online at the BBC Academy, and who is talking to us on online learning development trends. Myles assures me that he very much wants anybody just to plunge in and ask questions that don't feel sort of obliged to put your hand up or anything. Myles will be talking, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion session afterwards. But this is a informal, friendly session, so do please feel free to join in.
Thank you. Thanks everybody. Thank you. It's lovely to see a full room as well at lunchtime. Coming from an intense corporate culture of meetings, lunchtimes don't normally look this sort of welcoming. A bit more dry and more of a trial, so I'll try and buck that trend. Thanks very much for coming. I guess I'm going to make some qualifying remarks, as any good speaker should, just to offer a few caveats and a few kind of parachutes for myself over the course of the next 45 minutes or so. I was reflecting on this. I was on the Central Line on the way over and wondering whether what I was talking about developing trends in online learning are actually trends that are pretty well developed, that I think a lot of institutions and organisations who are interested in learning, training, development, currently might qualify, are actually struggling to respond to. I think it's probably more of the latter. I think a lot of the things I'm going to say, in some senses, are statements of the obvious. The statements of the obvious that I think that lots of institutions, and I'd be lucky to get your views on whether higher education can share some of these issues, but a lot of institutions and organisations are struggling with. So that's my first qualifier. My second qualifier is a little bit more formal, is that I stand, I was working a long time ago with someone from the London School of Economics who was a very expert coach and development, executive development guy. I was very lucky to spend some time with him, and he explained something that's called the imposter syndrome to me, where you stand in a room like this in front of a lot of people who expect you to be expert, and you actually think, I don't know anything about this at all, and you all look so kind of attentive and therefore qualified. But so I'm going to share with you actually a bunch of opinions. But I think their opinions, something to note about my opinions actually is they are only opinions, but I'm always right as well. So my opinions, I do think, qualify as special. But these opinions fall from roughly 16 years, whether that's a long time or not, working in the sort of digital, online, internet, new media arena. Much of that in the last 7 or 8 years or so in what you might call online learning and education. So that's from my current role in the BBC Academy, previously working in BBC Learning, which was mainly looking at offering learning content, products and services for school children, parents and teachers. But I think a lot of the ways technology applies are very similar. But also my opinions are formed from, and largely what I'm going to talk about now really, is from an organisation within the BBC called the BBC Academy. The BBC Academy was formed to bring together training, learning and development components of the BBC into one place. So it's a central function. It's intended to be a centre of expertise. But it's also, and this is quite interesting I think from the point of view of a kind of, certainly a corporate learning perspective, a training perspective, we have responsibility for offering products and services and content to help people in the BBC learn and develop, whether you're a journalist or a television producer or an engineer, but also to contribute to the development of skills and standards in the industry. That means we have to think quite differently in many respects from an organisation or a department. It's only looking within the organisation or institution. And quite a lot of what we've done, a lot of the things that we've worked on are formed from that external view. So a lot of the technologies that we would use and the tools that we would use are out there on the public web and the public internet, which makes them quite different from internal tools. And I think I'll come to why I think that's important. So I suppose what I want to do is really frame what I mean by these developing trends or developed trends and some of the pressures and challenges that they put on learning and on sort of organised formal learning, I guess, and we'll come back to that as well. So if you're faced with a learning need, what do you think of? And I think a lot of what people think of from a learning need is no matter how old this image is, of people sat in the seminar room, not you don't look like this, obviously much more colourful, but this preoccupation with learning taking place at a moment in time in an environment is still, I think, very, very powerful. It certainly forms a lot of the thinking in most of the organisations that I've worked with as suppliers to me, but also the way that we would construct what we create for people. Maybe you might look at something like this and you think, well, no, this is now a modern learning environment, or a more modern learning environment, which is effectively the same thing with screens. And obviously there's a lot of opportunity to do that. Things have changed enormously. There is a huge preoccupation, I think, with the notion of a learning opportunity or a learning experience being tied to those kind of historic conceptions. And I think one of I always listen very closely and read as close as I can and make sure. And I think one of the challenges to organisations doing this is because we tend to see ourselves as a solution, we tend to preserve the problems for which an organisation is the solution. If you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if you have a learning need, or you see a learning need, it's very hard to break out the notion of then creating a curriculum or a course or a classroom experience to meet that need. It's not just impulse and culture that does that. I think a lot of the way departments, institutions, and organisations are actually formed is to produce those experiences, and it's quite hard to break out of that. One of the things I think it's most productive, I think the challenge that we'll have, particularly I think in corporate learning, is you can reduce a learning need that equates to a training need that therefore equates to a course, and you have this kind of very simple equation of learning equals training equals course, and you always end up producing a course. For my contribution to that tends to be mostly, where we are in the course world, is mostly what we would call now, I suppose, traditional e-learning. And I guess many of you may have been through e-learning experiences that are kind of swarm-based, what used to be computer-based training, where you'll open up a module in a pop-up screen and you'll run through in a linear fashion what is a kind of a course, a simulation of those classroom experiences where you're subjected to the narrative and the timing and the pace. You can do it when you like, mostly, if you can access a corporate network or an institutional network remotely, but you're given the experience. And I think that's something that's a real challenge now, that there's an opportunity to break that equation of learning equals training equals course. In fact, I think there's probably something of an imperative to do that. So, about 3 years ago, when I started to plan as the head of online at the Academy, what could we do? What should we do with the online strategy for the BBC Academy? How can we make this work in a way that's relevant and useful for staff, and equally relevant and useful for those people who work in the broadcast industry in the UK who want to work in the broadcast industry, to make it as helpful as possible. So we did some what would you do? You do some research. This wasn't science. I started, was a kind of tactical research, just to get a sense of what is it, how would you describe a learning need, what do you do and where do you go? So in contrast to that, or even if it's more extreme than that, we started to discover that people are starting actually to look at these kinds of tools now. This is how people learn, or offer learning, or become teachers even. These are the kinds of environments. Again, this is why I said these aren't developing trends. In many respects, this is a statement of the obvious, that you would look to these content sources, these resources, and these tools as learning tools. And it's kind of interesting that how obvious that might seem, but how hard that can be then to construct something in an organisation that's used to behaving and used to performing in a certain way. And equally, how hard it can be sometimes to offer resources and content in these environments, or experiences that start from these environments, whether that be something that we've run workshops on Twitter, for example. We've run environments on Facebook where there's discussions with an expert around a topic. Very often you can do that with exactly the same ingredients, the same content, the same sort of expertise, the same tutor or teacher or expert, and the same participants. But people don't believe that's not learning, or not training, it's not education, it's something else. So there's a real, I think there's a significant perception problem there that's beyond only their providers. I think within organisations, within institutions, if it doesn't feel like that formal experience, often people will treat it quite differently, and therefore actually value it differently. I think that's a real challenge that everyone needs to overcome, because these tools clearly are so powerful and pervasive. As I said, please do stop me, ask questions or disagree or join in with this, at any time. One of the things that I think has become very interesting and extremely important in this newer world, I think it's new, it's not established yet, that palette of brands is developing very, very rapidly. But I think what's really powerful for those of us who are trying to offer social, digital, online learning experiences, courses, content, is that the expectations that are set by people who manage and build those products are very, very powerful, and they're setting the expectations for all of us, wherever we are. So if you look back to, go back, I guess Google's is always the easiest one to point to here, but I don't think it's necessarily the only one. I think particularly though iTunes, Apple, Khan Academy is a fantastic example of it now. They've all started from a very, very clear user focus, trying to usually help a user, not an audience member or a learner, but use is a powerful word, to help the user do something quite practical most of the time. So Google started trying to help people organise information, trying to find answers to how you might articulate that. Very significant focus on solving a user need. That puts the user in control. So rather than you being the person running through the e-learning course, in Google's world that would be reversed. It's kind of simplistically put, but I think it's quite a powerful thought. That you're in control of the resources that you're using, and in control of the tools that access those resources. As a user, you expect content now to be relevant. You expect to find that thing that you need to know, that thing that you want. And now I think find it quite quickly and quite simply. If you don't find something now, find a piece of information. In general, I think there are certain areas of high specialisation where obviously clearly it's going to be harder. But that expectation is powerful, and relevance I think is probably the most significant driving need that we really need to start to address or worry about. Search and discoverability are a given across all of those products, I think. It's a given that things will be laid out, tagged, organised in an architecture and an environment in a way that you can just find them. They're just there. You can browse them, you can search for them. You should and could be able to share them. Whether people really do meaningfully share them, I don't know. I think sometimes yes, sometimes no. I think we're all finding out about that. I think that's been, from what Matt was saying, I think that's been a lot of the content of these sessions around the sense of what does sharing do and mean when we're learning. That content is reusable as well. I think this is possibly one of the most powerful thoughts for those of us who are constructing content in a learning environment, is that we should no longer expect to create something that sits there and is complete. The notion that something can be reused, repurposed, even just in it being shared, is really, really important. That you can add value to it, change it, and explore it as the learner and as the user. I think is a really powerful thought, and quite different from those kind of class-focused formal experiences where you come to school or student. They're very, very simple, or they start being simple, and it's another obvious and easy thing to say. But from my experience in product development and product management, trying to create something simple is really hard. It's really hard. It's why so many products don't succeed, because they fail at that bar. I think we talked a little bit about social and reusability, but also I think there's a crucial component here. But this is again a very, very hard one to achieve, particularly when managing finite resources, where those resources of expertise, time, content. Is that most of those brands, but all of them, offer an experience or content that's fresh and timely. So the relevance is clearly there, the accuracy is there, but they feel like they're relevant now. So they need to feel and be new. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to blog and publish and tweet all the time every day, but you need to be offering things that feel like they're relevant and right for now, and that they're presented at the right moment. All of these things, I think, are really obvious statements of a successful digital product. But I don't think these things are easy to achieve. Certainly, I spent quite a lot of time not achieving them, and still struggling with them, even only this morning. But I think there's something in here. There's a change in mindset in the learning environment. That's some quite simple but powerful thoughts about how you try and present sources of expertise, experts themselves, content, and the notion of feedback as well. Feedback is I think these notions of shareability and social experience put feedback on a very democratic footing, which is again quite different. If you're in a more formal and traditional training and learning environment, there tends to be an expert who is less democratically presented perhaps. I feel nervous about saying this in an academic institution surrounded by students and members of faculty, so I'll stop there. No one disagreed that part. So one of the things that this led me to start to think is, these are web learning tools. The tools that are developed for learning purposes. Are they special? I started to have quite interesting disagreements with colleagues and some people who work, particularly in the e-learning industry, who offer lots of products and services that are dedicated to learning as a special thing, a special experience, that it's different in the product, so it's not necessarily different in the outcome. And I think I quite like this list. So this is a list of top 10 tools of the top 100 from this organisation called the Centre for Learning and Performance Technologies, who run a survey every year. I think they're running the current survey around about now. And it's an open survey for those who are in and around the learning environment. Mainly, I think it's not only, but I think it's mainly corporate learning, but I think there's plenty of broader education in here as well. And so these are the top 10 most popular, most relevant tools. None of them are learning specialist tools. There's one, I think, in the top 20, Google, which is an online, it's a learning management system, or it's an open open source platform for learning management system development. So all of these are things that we would normally use every day for productivity, communication, organising our own information, finding things out, getting things done. They are productivity tools. They're not specialist tools. And I think they also are very, very successful at putting those user needs first, that I was talking about earlier. But they work in kind of almost in two ways. I think these are very, for me as a learner, these are things that I would use naturally. If I want to find something out, I want to ask a question, I want to explore something, I want to organise my thoughts or ideas or information, I would easily turn to these when I want to learn. I think what's becoming quite interesting now is that a lot of people who are broadly teaching or offering expertise are also turning to these as well, as mechanisms for staying in touch, setting work, assessing, sharing information. It becomes that I think that they're usefully democratic in that respect, in a way that a lot of more formal tools and products aren't. They're there for the institution or the organisation to run through their learning requirements in quite a different way. So I think these offer, in a sense, they offer quite an interesting challenge, but they also offer opportunity, and they're all free as well. So I guess that's not necessarily true for Dropbox and Evernote. There are premium subscription versions, but largely you can use a lot of the power of these for nothing at the moment. Actually, interesting. I mean, these, I imagine these are all things people use, but you guys involved in learning education, these things that you would naturally use as part of your learning, these are just tools that you don't even think about them as learning tools, they're just things that you use. Cool thing. I'll take it from yours. It's unanimous for free. And one of the things, though, that I think becomes quite challenging, I've experienced this a lot, particularly in the last couple of years, where we've tried to explore application of these kinds of tools and experiences, and I think this is partly back to that Clay Shirky quote, is that people get very anxious from within a more kind of well-known or traditional world of learning and training about the notion that these digital experiences will substitute. They're there to substitute the more traditional face-to-face, seminar-based, course-based experiences. And I think that's a really dangerous debate to get into. I've done it many times, and I fall for it frequently. So, but I think the point is that the reason that these things are useful and powerful and helpful is because they add to, supplement, and add value and extend the reach of what a formal and more traditional learning experiences can be. It's very, very difficult, particularly in an organisation like the BBC, which is very fond of meetings. and is a very openly communicative organisation. Verbal communication in an organisation like the BBC and most media organisations is very, very important. The notion that we can apply technologies to substitute that is pretty hard to come to terms with. But in the knowledge that those kinds of social learning experiences in the real world, as it were, are really, really powerful, and an enormous amount of value can be added to those experiences, to extend them, and to take the content out of them, and to apply them elsewhere. But it's very, very dangerous, I think, to assume or to plan for the fact that these technologies are going to substitute what you would see as more traditional learning. I become very nervous about, although having said that, as I said, I do get involved in that debate, but have yet to conclude it successfully. I think we're trying to plan more for a world where these things are readily available, they're very easy to use and very easy to apply, and we can sort of almost mix them in with the curriculum in a more intuitive way, take some of the resistance out of and the operational difficulty out of arranging physical learning in that way. I think there's an enormous amount of value in application along those lines. So I think what we've been trying to do, and are starting to try and do in a bit more of a purposeful way now, is to, what I suppose, solve a kind of a training or a sort of traditional training or e-learning problem. So we've looked at courses and classes, whether those be online or physical. Mainly, I think we've been looking mostly, to my budget, at online world. So we've been looking at courses and classes which have a great deal of value. They're familiar, which is really powerful. You know what you're going to get with a course. It's a well-used phrase. It describes something that we all know. That means they're easy to produce. Doesn't necessarily mean they're kind of quick or cheap, but there's an easier to apply formula to make them work. They're formal and linear, which can be narrow. It's a good thing. You know what you're going to get. So predictability isn't always against the beautiful serendipity of the web. I know predictability can seem dreary, but that actually is really helpful when you're spending money to know that you're spending money on something you know you're going to get. They're trackable, which is very helpful. So you can see what the people know. How well they've done it, how quickly they've done it, etc. And they can offer very rich experiences, either rich media or rich social experiences. So they're powerful. Against that point of substitution, the risk of substitution, you start, I think, tend to use them. But they are easy to find. They are expensive by comparison. I personally think they're hard to maintain, or easy, quick, and cheap ways of maintaining them are harder to come by so far. They tend to take a long time, and I've done some really interesting studies about how long people will concentrate online at the moment. It feels the YouTube generation and all those hackneyed phrases do suggest that we don't have much attention span anymore. I wonder whether we ever really did have these unhacked. But online, 5 to 15 minutes, depending on whether you're reading or watching, feels like quite a long time these days. Anything so long tends to be bad or less favoured. These things tend to be locked away in internal locally, so they tend to belong to an organisation and an organisation's systems. So they're hard to distribute, they're hard to share, and they tend to be exclusive therefore. So I think, from our point of view, the BBC with some responsibility to share these resources, that's a challenge as well. One of the things, because we're a media organisation, we tend to think about things, particularly around video, as kind of long form clips, some of the language that the BBC was used for video experiences. So we have this notion, I suppose, and it's a kind of shorthand notion, that shorter form online learning, we tend to use a shorthand of a clip. It doesn't have to be a video, it could be a post, a blog, it could be an article, it could be audio, but it tends to be a kind of shorter, simpler piece of content. These are great because they're open, they're distributed in the ways that I've already said, they are easy to discover, they're short or shorter, so they don't tend to have that attention span challenge. They're cheaper, depending on how much production value is important to you. They can be very costly or not so much. I think production value and production quality often become confused. The right level of quality for the right environment, for the right use is probably more important perhaps than production values if you're not going on air, which most of us aren't in our daily. They're flexible as well. felt bland and flexible. I hadn't used this slide quite a few times and hadn't noticed it. The hard quality controls, which is very useful. They're standardised and they're shareable. They're standard, I guess you know, a YouTube clip is very easy to use. It's very easy to make, produce, upload, and then distribute. So I think that notion of things being the standard format or using standard protocols is very powerful as well. But against that, they're short, it's hard to interact with them. Mostly they tend to be content, it's published content rather than usable in an interactive manner. Brevity means it's hard to treat things in depth. In a clip, it's quite hard. You explain and describe in some of the context. It's tricky. They're not familiar in the way that you know, if you, and this still happens now, you can look at something that's often under the banner of YouTube, EDU, and still people will think this is just a clip. It's not. This isn't education. This is just YouTube. This is where the skateboarding squirrels are. So that familiarity, it hasn't. It's a long way from being one. I think, yeah. Even though YouTube is going to own the world in moments, I'm sure. Packaging these things together is difficult, but accreditation and measurement against that notion of familiarity and kind of validity is a real challenge as well. So we've been trying to work out, you know, if those dimensions make sense. How can we organise ourselves? So we've come up with some ideas. So this is kind of, I suppose, sharing more builds, probably more typos, of how are we trying to work ourselves around this? That we can't work in a world where we kind of have, on the one hand, short form distributed content that's available with those strengths and weaknesses, and then right at the other end of the spectrum, towards another end of the spectrum, the notion of formal learning, it feels too unwieldy. We're missing a whole territory, I think, in the middle here of really valuable learning content or learning tools and experiences. So we're trying to do a couple of things, is to unpack that notion of courses and classes, to try and unravel those more linear and more, I guess, kind of glued together experiences. So are there components of what you might call a course that could come out and live on their own, or be joined in different ways to other content? We're looking at things like apps and ebooks. We're looking more as well at the Mozilla Foundation's Open Badges program, which is quite an interesting way of offering almost like a scaffolding experience that you can work through and know that it's feeling accredited, but there's a signal of the fact that you've done something, or you've done a number of different things along the direction. I think there's something quite interesting and valuable in that. There's a lot for Mozilla and the rest of us to work out there, but I think there's some real signals of value. And another thing that we're trying to do, and we're making more headway with this, partly because it's technically simple at the moment, is that we publish a lot of short-form content at bbc.co.uk/academy for journalists and content producers of films and how to make editorial judgments, how to make content, how to publish, etc. So we're trying to work out, are there ways that we can gather an article or a series of films into collections where you can kind of offer, again, a different way of that scaffold experience. You've got things as a guide rather than kind of randomised and difficult to manage playlists on YouTube as well. And trying to think, well, are there ways of creating a playlist of content that you can offer up an order of narrative through that content that can be a more expert guide to something like managing an interview as a journalist or as a factual content producer. How can you offer something that can step people through that process in a light way, but also make the most of the fact that that content can be joined into what we're calling a playlist. It's one way of offering a curated experience. But a curated experience often, it kind of falls out of the fact that you kind of tag things up and suggest an organisational principle, suggest a navigation system. It's very hard to follow, very hard to know where you are. And personalisation is something we're quite interested in as well. I think not necessarily to offer the most relevant, most useful learning for me right now, because that's quite hard. That's quite hard for us to achieve technically. But also, you need a lot of content to make that work. But to offer ways that people make sense of it for themselves, and then gathering and collecting it for themselves as well. So we're trying to do a couple of things to almost join those two different ways of thinking. We're trying to create something that feels more organised than just a series of just what they might offer, and then packaging them in pieces and clips. Now, I don't know, this is risk of teaching people to suck eggs, but there's a model of corporate learning that suggests the way people learn in an organisation is you can broadly split into 3 different groups. So if 100% of your learning is available, and 10% of that you achieve through formal training and formal courses, I'm sure these are very, very seductively round numbers, so I'm sure I'm not doing the methodology justice. 20% is through coaching, mentoring, and experience, so that's asking the expert near you, finding the expert who's done this before, asking someone who's clearly more experienced than yourself, and then just through having a go. Through 70% of learning at work, this model argues is just having a crack at things, and I guess making mistakes and getting things better. I think, as I said, whether these numbers are oversimplified or not, I think there's something intuitive in the fact that it's very hard to offer 100% of learning through formal training and formal experience. This is where we have that an incredible infrastructure and resource at hand to be able to do that. I think the notion that then digital tools can start to identify sources of coaching and expertise that help people when they're out there in the wild of work and managing their own experiences is a really powerful thought. One of the things I think that the Academy, I think we try to do in the BBC Academy, particularly in the online world of the BBC Academy, is we try to offer the BBC as a source of expertise and experience. It's very handy to have the letters BBC in front of it, because that clearly denotes what it's about, and it has certain signals of kind of heritage and quality as well. But if we can offer that as a kind of signal of expertise and experience, then actually we can not necessarily substitute that. As I said, I think that's risky, but you can really start to unlock some of the potential that exists within the organisation, within and without, to offer those sources of mentoring experience and expertise. I think that's really important. And also then, I guess, that if we can organise the content as effectively as possible, but that's 70% of the time that most of us are out there just trying to get things done and trying to work it out. So we don't have time, we don't even know we're learning, we're just doing something. Having those resources at hand is really, really powerful. There's one couple of things I'll close on, is that, and I think because largely of the experience and the notion of this model, there's a couple of phrases that we've started to use kind of almost as kind of guiding principles, I suppose, as shorthand for how to help people learn online, and particularly learn online at work, time for, etc. And the first is the notion of show, don't tell, and that means that the notion of a kind of a manual, guidelines, and use of almost like the Haynes manual for how things work is really hard to sell now. The notion that you'll be offered a tool that doesn't just work in the way that Wikipedia just works or YouTube just is usable is quite difficult to sell. But people tend now to want to be shown how it works. And the notion that online video is particularly helpful for that. It's an obvious but powerful thought. The notion of kind of writing a guide for how things work feels quite hard to understand these days. And married to that is the notion of how to, and this is kind of where YouTube is the most remarkable learning and education resource, I think, is that I can't think of many things now, although again this is a dangerous audience to make this assertion, but here we go. I can't think of many things now that you can't actually find out how to do on YouTube. Not necessarily that you'll be an expert and you'll be able to do it perfectly, but most things that you need to get done, particularly if they are an answer to a how-to question, which has a sense of practicality, mastering a skill or some kind of activity, then offering resources that answer the question how to or how do I is a really, really useful way forward. And if you can marry that with a clear signal and sense of expertise or experience, so that the person is qualified and has some kind of heritage or is clearly expert in answering that question of how to is really, really important. And personally, I'm fascinated to see how Google and YouTube move in the education world because of that sense of power of answering that question how to, answering quickly and well, is very, very different. I think it's becoming almost an expectation now. You can just find out how to quickly from one resource as well, from one variety of publishing resources. I think there was a few, sorry, going through some other lecture points. I guess this perhaps, there's one final thought. This is more as a note to myself and perhaps for an audience of people who are involved in a world of making and using and developing online resources to learn. I came into a world where people were talking about instructional design and various kind of special, obscure learning language and skills. I find that's okay. But I think the notion of product management and product management skills are really, really powerful. That's what those brands that I showed on that slide earlier do so well. They're really good at user-focused design. They're really good at organising information architecture in a way that shows you the joins, shows you where to go next, makes it simple to understand from your point of view, user interface, user experience. These are vital skills for presenting things in a way that can help people learn. And the notion of managing a product through its life cycle is again, there's nothing new about that, but it's quite a different approach. You release frequently, monitor, observe, and then move on from there. I think these are quite different ways of thinking about how you move learning into an online world. But I think again, there are a couple of instances. So, I think, I'm not sure, didn't you go over time there? That's what I will pause.
Absolutely. Yeah, brilliant. Right, thank you, Myles. Lots and lots of interesting points, I think. There are a lot to digest. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to start off with? Yeah.
Hello. Thank you very much for all these thoughts. I would like to hear a little bit about personalization and how you try to achieve that, and probably some of your challenges.
Yeah, I suppose some of the challenges that we've had, I guess, are infrastructure challenges that to try and create a kind of engine for personalisation isn't simple or easy. It's really quite hard to manage the user account and all the data associated with it, and then to create something almost on the fly for people. And that's really quite hard to do well. I think one of the things that's challenged that is the notion that you can search and discover what you need anyway. So I think that's tended to undermine what used to be the kind of the my Yahoo or my iGoogle approach, where you organise things for yourself and you can just find what you need anyway. So I think that's undermined some of that. What we tended to do is we've used more used, I suppose, Twitter and Facebook and social media as ways of trying to place content that's available in ways that people can organise for themselves in the environments and using the tools that they already use. I think that we've found seems to be more successful. The hard part is we don't really know what's happening. And so we lose them. We've arguably lost some data and getting exactly that tracking idea which people, which is rightly valued. It's much harder to pull that off. I think there are tools and techniques to still try and do that, but it's hard to know who's done it, what they've done, what's happened there. So that's the approach we tend to take. Partly, I suppose, that approach is kind of quicker and easier as well. We say it's either quicker or easier, simpler.
Yeah, I have to ask, where does the BBC see itself fitting in support you to make MOOCs? Are you a partner in MOOCs?
I think again, it's a good question. I think we've been talking to, particularly we've had some initial conversations with some of the organisations that are involved. I think I guess we'd see it now as a fascinating development that we need to start to explore probably more meaningfully. I think that where we'll need to work things out is the notion of how do we present what BBC has to offer, how do we wrap that up, notions of accreditation, etc. become quite interesting where BBC has certain considerations that maybe other providers don't have in those. But I think there's some issues that we need to work through in that respect. I think what's really interesting about MOOCs is that notion of being able to, if it's on that continuum of course and clear, I think what MOOCs becomes a really interesting way of trying to sort of marry some of the content that's already available, that's produced by organisations, and I think we would see ourselves as an interesting and useful contributor to that content. And the MOOC obviously is a great way, I think, of trying to start to offer that context and some of that additional sort of learning experience and structure.
Just to get your feedback from your experience, really, it's probably not a populist view, but with the sort of availability of all the tools that you said, and particularly YouTube, is there not a danger of throwing sort of the baby out with the bathwater in that, we want instant gratification about our learning, and we're promoting short-termism in our learning rather than promoting long-term deep learning? I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
I think there is, I suppose, partly about that risk of substitution. You think it's either one thing or the other. I suppose my hope is that we find ways of principles and tools and techniques for organising those shorter form experiences into something that's deeper and more meaningful. But also I think there is the opportunity to present them in a way that you can offer question, feedback, access to expertise, as an additional way of going deeper or exploring more deeper. I think the challenges that I've been fascinated to see this kind of YouTube effect and that how-to phenomenon. It just seems it's so fast, so powerful that I think we kind of have to find ways of working with it. I think sort of denying it and trying to defend against it feels like that time has passed. So I think it's more about you need to use other opportunities to help organise it, but also use it as a publishing platform. But I think one of the things that YouTube hasn't succeeded in doing at all yet is offering signals of quality. And I think that's where organisations and institutions can play a part. You don't necessarily need, and we're exploring some of this, you don't necessarily need to be the producer of the content. But if you have a brand that can organise, that can be the qualified editor of experiences, then I think you start to help people make sense of an environment like YouTube. Help them organise, help them go deeper, help them spot connections that might not be obvious in the way people will use it. I think that's an interesting territory. Yeah, but no, I don't have an answer. Just to say, well, I'm on camera.
I suppose slightly related to that, I was wondering about the dealing with the variety of user needs and variety of user expectations, and in particular, I suppose, an age-related question, the hackneyed cliche about dealing with an age cohort, probably older, who will have run screen for a lot of these technologies, not necessarily all of them, but some of them, as compared with an age cohort who are thoroughly tech savvy, who are Gen Yers, to use the current class phrase, and who will obviously are utterly wedded to it all. How is there any way of meeting both their expectations?
I think it's interesting. I suppose that the sort of the digital purist and optimist in me would say that if you get these things right, they're so simple and easy to use that there's never a risk of that. I think that's possibly a bit naive because obviously they're being offered on a device that some people just find utterly alien still. So I think you need to be very careful of that. I think where it might start to become interesting, I guess thinking from the point of view of a media organisation, is that now you can access internet content or web-based content through more familiar devices. So this may be where things like IPTVs and things like Chromecast, Apple TV, which are easier, I don't think they're necessarily simple or obvious yet, but I think there might be an opportunity to start to bring in some of this kind of content exploration. Whether those things become social tools and interactive, I think it is a challenge. I think simplicity is the key. I think the point is that I guess within an organisation, and the BBC has quite a range of demographics from the very, very entry-level graduates through people who worked for a very long time, who've seen this technological change. And I think it's the key has always been making it clear that this is relevant and useful, and therefore there's a payout, which helps people. And I suppose there's a bit of a handrail as we go through some of those more worrying experiences.
Yes, you will get to.
Yeah, because
the price on the price.
Yes, there's a point to this. Other people have done it. There is a value. You can it's part of what you need to do anyway, rather than just feeling you're missing out on something that everybody else is doing. Which I think causes an unnecessary anxiety.
Yes.
Doesn't mean.
Point at the back, yeah.
I'm really interested in the concept of online environment being a democratizer, and I really believe it. I'm particularly interested in the context of the developing world or countries. So, are there any organisations that are working really well to provide learning for people about how to navigate the online environment, but like globally? Do you know?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting. I suppose I don't know that I know of any for certain, but I think something that we've seen more recently is some of the giants of the digital economy are starting to understand that challenge, and they're doing some quite exotic things like offering internet access through air balloons and drones. And there's some Facebook and Google, the two examples which I've heard of. But I think what's interesting, not necessarily about that we should all go and buy drones, and that's the answer. But I think that the notion of it's almost the value is in the access, the connectivity. Partly now because I think a lot of the challenges on the content and the product side are less significant than they were. So you don't, the fact that you can access, you can find things more easily, things are more likely to be available in different languages or translatable. How high quality is obviously an issue. But I think the access challenge almost feels like things are solved now, not so much the content challenge. I think that's quite interesting. I guess some of these experiments of trying to offer access to remote parts and much less developed. Be interested to see what happens next. What do people do? Do they exploit these learning opportunities, or do they then go and do something else? That's less perhaps going to be right. Other things that the internet is famous for.
I was going to ask if you could give some examples of what the BBC Academy have done to bridge that continuum you're talking about from courses.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that we've done. So we've been looking at iBooks recently. There's an interesting kind of lightweight way of packaging content. So we've done a couple of development examples of that, which we haven't been able to make public as yet for a variety of reasons. That's been quite interesting. So I think that's shown. I think it's been interesting to see what can you do to create kind of linear chapters in a well-known packaged environment, often in that instance by Apple, that is a different way of structuring what we would normally offer as a course. So you're offering this, it's quite rich media, obviously, because it's the BBC, we can offer very well produced video, imagery, and audio, which I think is, we're very fortunate from that point of view. That's been quite interesting, because that's starting to find a middle ground. And one of the things that iBooks are useful for is familiarity. People kind of get it. Tablets are obvious enough for many people now to know what you have. And we've been exploring as well as playlist options. So we started to look to YouTube to create playlists of content by third parties that are organised by BBC Academy. We've started to look at organising our own playlists of content. And I think what we're trying to do is step in the direction of, well, how can we then start to mix existing content, whether it's BBC or not, mainly BBC, with then almost like interstitial moments that say the next part of this playlist is about lighting your interview. Then you see that, and then so you offer a kind of clear narrative through of pieces that make sense on their own, but also hopefully then with those interstitials you make sense as a kind of playlist narrative that starts to organise things. So I think those are some of the steps that we're taking now, just to see how does that work from a production point of view? Is the content available either from us or from us and others? But also what do we need to signal to users to make them understand that this isn't just a clip? This is a clip that's part of the body of work. I think that's what we're finding the hardest part, though, because people are so used to this notion that you ask them, it's the notion that this is a clip about something. It's 4 minutes long and done, and then there's no signal of where to go next. So I think that's the part that we're kind of probably frowning most deeply about at the moment. But it feels, I don't know, to me that's where, it feels like quite rich territory.
It's all at the beginning at the moment.
Yeah, it is at the moment, at the moment. But I'm happy to, I think we're making reasonable progress on most of those things, so hopefully in the next few months we might have something more substantial to point to. Yeah.
would like to pick something from what you said and ask a little bit of a technical question. For these playlists,
Yeah.
have you experienced any difficulty in curating this content? I suppose for clips or videos that are open educational sources, there's no problem at all. But have you experienced any difficulty with others' content in terms of intellectual property rights?
One of the things that
Any objections or?
No, we haven't experienced that. I guess on the basis that mostly, if you're careful in the research, you can see if something's first party published or redistributed. We have experienced a couple of instances where things have just disappeared, so the owner has taken it down. And then, if that's part of your narrative, it disappears. What do you do then? I don't know what you do then. Actually, any idea is welcome. I think that's what's interesting is that from a publishing point of view, you're not in total editorial control. So the context, the comment stream, etc. are there. You can't do anything other than use what's available. So the editorial decision making becomes quite different. It's more about, it's not so much a technology challenge. I think it's just it's kind of a sort of editorial management challenge.
Okay, just before bringing things to a close, can I just remind you of our next session on the 9th of April, which will have Claire Shaw from the Guardian HE network talking about social media and the Guardian HE blog. That's the 9th of April in the same room.
I think it's 246.
In 246, which is just one corridor. Quite a nice room. But concluding, let's please join with me in thanking Myles for an excellent, very interesting talk. Thank you.